I followed my wife as she sneaked out at night and saw her take a shortcut to her lover's house. The phrase seemed absurd, surreal, like one of those things we read on anonymous internet forums or hear on late-night dramatic podcasts. But it was my life. It was my wife. And it was our house that she left behind every Wednesday with the most lame and repetitive excuse anyone could come up with: yoga class. Yoga at 10 at night, with impeccable makeup, strong perfume and a dress she only wore on wedding anniversaries. I pretended to believe, smiled, kissed her on the forehead and went to the office to pretend that everything was fine, but deep down something had already broken and I was just waiting for the pieces to cut through my skin. One night I followed her. Without much of a plan, just intuition throbbing in the chest. I watched as she turned off the main avenue and took a hidden alley, which led straight to an old house with low lights and an unkempt garden. There, she did not hesitate. He rang the doorbell as if he already knew the way, and soon the door opened, revealing the silhouette of a man, tall, with a poorly buttoned dress shirt. They hugged. They kissed. They laughed at something. And when they entered, the porch lights went out. I stood in the car, shaking. I took the photo with my hand almost shaking. I felt stupid. I felt small. 20 years at her side and I was now a stranger watching everything from the outside, like a spectator of a play that he himself financed. I returned home with my stomach churning, wondering if I would burn everything, destroy every painting in that room decorated with our false love, or simply disappear into the world without leaving a trace. But I waited. And when she walked through the door with that fake sparkle in her eyes, I prepared myself for a scene she would never forget. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything on the floor. I just put my cell phone on the table and showed the photo. Her face fell. The mouth trembled, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't cry. And that's when, with a coldness I never knew I had, I said, "It's over. Tomorrow you'll receive the papers. You're no longer my wife. You're just a stranger who used my bed as a shortcut to cheating." She begged. He begged on his knees, crying like a scared child. It was a mistake, just one night, I swear, I love you, the same phrases that all traitors must repeat when they see their life falling apart. But it wasn't just one night. I found out later that it was months. Months in which she hugged me in the morning and at night she was in the arms of someone else. The shock was not only in the betrayal, but in the certainty that the love I thought I was experiencing was, in fact, a well-staged illusion. Worst of all, she was different. More confident. More vain. And I, stupid, thought it was because of me. I thought things were finally getting better between us. I was mistaken. What she didn't know, and would never imagine, was that I also had a secret. I was also close to someone. Someone who had been listening to my outbursts for a long time, comforted me in the early hours when I said I felt something was wrong. Someone who, by a cruel twist of fate, knew my wife very well. As good as me, or maybe better. A person who was always by our side, invisible, patient, like a silent shadow, waiting for the moment to be noticed. I didn't cheat on her. Not like her. But I was about to do something that would change everything. Something that would make my wife regret it until the last day of her life. In the days following my decision, she went into an emotional meltdown. I even knocked on my work door. I sent videos crying. I asked for forgiveness. He offered to share everything, give up on his lover, try again, take me on trips, start over. But there was no more room for a fresh start. She destroyed the home with her own hands and expected me to sweep up the pieces. No. I was in another direction now. Reconnecting with who I was before I just became her husband. Discovering simple pleasures, meeting old friends, remembering my essence. But mainly, giving space to those who really valued me. Fate, however, had even crueler and more surprising plans. Months later, she tried to get back on her feet. She left her lover, or was dumped, no one knows. She tried to start over alone, without me, without the applause she used to get. And that's when the truth emerged, without me having to lift a finger. It happened so unexpectedly that even I, who thought I had already experienced the worst, was in shock. The pain she caused me came back to her like a boomerang, only with 10 times greater force. She discovered that her lover was never faithful to her either. And the worst, while she lied to me, he lied to her. But what she would never imagine is that the person he cheated on her with was someone we knew very well. So well that one word from me would have been enough to completely destroy the last bit of dignity she was trying to maintain. That cold smile she saw on my face when she asked me for forgiveness and I just said, "Time will show everything," it was no coincidence. It was calculation. It was control. And the most surprising thing is that the person behind the twist in this story, the one who was the true silent avenging angel, was the last person my wife would imagine. A twist worthy of a script she would write herself, if she could go back in time. But it was too late. Because there, in the midst of the destruction of a marriage, something new sprouted. A genuine love. A true fresh start. And as absurd as it may seem, it all started with her betrayal. The remaining curiosity is, who was this silent person? What did she do to turn the story upside down? And how did the woman who destroyed our home finally have the bitter taste of her own lie? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we do not support cheating in any form. All stories are fiction based on realistic situations, and the objective is one, to show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and hearts. Each narrative is a warning, not an encouragement. Now, take a deep breath. Get ready. 'Cause what are you about to hear will shock you. In everyone's eyes, Daniel and Laura were the ideal couple. Together for almost 15 years, they shared a life built on effort, complicity and a history full of memories that ranged from their college days to silent dinners on the porch at home, on days when the world seemed to spin more slowly. He, a meticulous architect, owner of a gaze that seemed to always observe the invisible, passionate about lines, spaces and silence. She is an advertiser with a vibrant soul, a captivating smile and an energy that fills any environment. They balanced each other. While he was introspective, methodical and detail-oriented, she was spontaneous, intuitive and spoke with her hands. It was as if one filled the other's empty spaces. They lived in a house that had Daniel's signature on every corner. Not just for the architectural choices, but for the silent intentions behind every detail. He designed that home with his hands and his heart. The large windows provided Laura with natural light at her work desk. The balcony with wooden floors, ideal for Sunday breakfasts. The open kitchen, which she dreamed of so much, where the two of them cooked together on lighter days. There was a shelf in the room with dozens of books, many never read, but all hand-picked by her just for the cover, the title or some phrase on the back cover that touched her on any given day. And he, always careful, said that Laura's books were like her, the content didn't matter, the presence was enough. Laura, in turn, was proud of her husband. I admired the way he saw the world, as if everything had a mathematical reason, a perfect fit. Some days it irritated her deeply. He took a long time to make decisions, he needed to plan everything. It was made of impulse, emotion, desires that came and went. But deep down, it was this difference that kept the two in constant movement. For years, they learned to dance between contrasts. When they argued, Laura was the first to move away, needing space. Daniel, over time, learned to wait. To respect their silence and then open their arms. And she came back. He always came back. Until then, this was how everything worked. They had a son, Luca, now 9 years old, who had inherited his father's observant gaze and his mother's emotional intensity. A sweet boy, with deep questions for his age and a charming habit of narrating his life out loud, as if he were the protagonist of a film. For Daniel, being a father was the most important project in his life. Since Luca's arrival, he started reducing his work outside the city, refusing tempting offers to be more present. Laura, although absolutely in love with her son, felt, from time to time, missing the woman she was before motherhood. I missed certain freedoms, some silences, spaces that now always seemed occupied. The years passed, and with them came routines that slowly shaped their lives into predictable blocks. Coffee at 7. School at 8. Meetings, traffic, supermarket, dinner at 8:30, series at 9. It wasn't unhappiness. It wasn't worn-out love. It was just real life, as it is for almost everyone. Sometimes, amidst the daily chaos, Laura found herself looking at Daniel in silence. He is focused on his notebook, organizing floor plans, sometimes wearing his glasses on the tip of his nose. And in those moments, she wondered if she was still seen, if he still noticed her with the same intensity as he did in his early years. Not because of a lack of love, but because of the weight of time, the demands, the urgencies that fill every gap in the days. Daniel, in turn, also had his own concerns. Lately, I noticed Laura more distant, more airy. She was there, but her thoughts seemed to be elsewhere. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask questions. He was the type to respect other people's spaces, perhaps too much. But on some early mornings, when he woke up and she wasn't in bed, his mind began to construct silent hypotheses, which he later dismissed as paranoia. After all, everyone has difficult days. And he trusted her. Always trusted. From the beginning. Laura was his truth in the world. Weekends, although lovingly planned, began to feel less spontaneous. The old complicity, the laughter between one glass of wine and another, became more scarce. There was still affection, long hugs and goodnight kisses, but it was as if something there was different, out of tune. Close friends noticed the wear, but no one dared comment. From the outside, they were still the model couple. Those that everyone admired, who seemed to have found the magic formula for lasting love. When they were in public, they knew how to maintain their image. She is always radiant. He is always serene. Laura had a best friend, Clara, with whom she shared almost everything. From the most banal dramas to the most delicate confessions. Clara was more than a friend. He was almost part of the family. He was present at birthdays, end-of-year parties, impromptu trips. Always discreet, balanced, a reliable shoulder in any crisis. Daniel liked her. I trusted her. I knew that Laura needed this feminine space to breathe, to be herself away from the demands of home, her son, and work. Clara knew how to listen, advise, laugh at the absurdities of life with an acidic tone that Laura loved. It was the presence that demanded nothing, but offered everything. Laura's work environment was also demanding. The creative sector of the agency where I worked was undergoing a reformulation. She was more involved than ever, which justified more frequent outings, last-minute appointments, and short trips. Daniel understood. Never questioned. He himself had gone through phases like this. Sometimes Laura would come back late at night, exhausted, and just lie down in silence. Other times, he arrived with energy, wanting to talk about campaigns, ideas, new people he had met. And he listened. Even when I didn't understand the enthusiasm, even when I just wanted to sleep. Sundays were the most delicate days. Those were the days when silence weighed more. The mornings seemed to drag on with promises of rest that weren't fulfilled. Laura sometimes spent hours locked in her makeshift office, claiming she needed to get ahead on a project. Daniel, on the balcony, drew sketches that he would not take anywhere. Luca played in the backyard with a dog called Bento, a faithful companion who seemed to notice when the atmosphere in the house fluctuated. The boy, intuitive like few others, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Are you still happy? Why don't you and Mom smile together anymore? Daniel, in his usual sensitivity, tried to respond with metaphors that Luca only partially understood. Laura, when she listened, smiled wryly and changed the subject. But there were good moments. There always was. Unexpected laughter during dinner. They exchange complicit glances when they see Luca dancing awkwardly in the middle of the room. Gifts left on the bed. Affectionate messages on random days. The memory of the good times was still strong. That was what held them together. The story they had built. Mutual respect. Love, even if silent. Daniel believed, almost naively, that all difficult phases passed. That true love resisted time, tiredness, short distances. Laura, on the other hand, was beginning to question whether it was enough to live a life where everything was right, but without the intensity of before. Was she losing herself? Or was it just the natural cycle of long relationships? These questions echoed in your mind more often than you would like. But she didn't share this with anyone. Not even with Daniel. Not even with Clara. And it was precisely in this silence, in this space between what is said and what is felt, that the gears of history began to move imperceptibly. There was no betrayal, pain or revelations yet. Just the seed of something to come. Something that would call into question everything that couple believed about love, loyalty, and truth. And they still had no idea. Laura began to change little by little, as the seasons changed without anyone noticing the exact day when winter stopped being cold or summer became milder. At first it was imperceptible, a new perfume, a different shine in the hair, a slightly bigger laugh for something Daniel hadn't said. Then came the small but repeated absences. Unforeseen meetings, agency events that didn't exist before, take a break from the routine that she naturally justified. Daniel observed everything without judging, without affirming, with the silent patience that characterized him, convinced that love required space to breathe. But there was a worry that began to settle in his chest like a thorn that didn't hurt, but it didn't stop being. Clara was still present, as always. A constant, familiar, and almost comforting figure. He had been in both for years, knew Laura's every gesture and shared her secrets that Daniel would never imagine. Although he didn't suspect it, this closeness sometimes made him feel like a guest within his own privacy. Laura and Clara understood each other without words, with complicit looks, with a story that preceded the wedding and would survive if it ever ended. Daniel respected this friendship, even valued it, but in his inner jurisdiction, she began to wonder if he was the one who had unknowingly been left out of an essential part of his wife's life. The days stretched like a taut rope. The house was still the same, the dishes were still in place, Luca's laughter filled the corners of that innocence that still doesn't understand what it's like to lose something that was believed to be eternal. Daniel took refuge in his work, in his son, in the little things. But at night, when Laura left with the excuse of a dinner with colleagues, a networking event or a simple need for space, her mind began to construct alternative realities. I didn't say it out loud, but there were nights when he would lie awake until he heard the lock click. I didn't spy on her, I didn't question her, but she took note. Mentally. In silence. Like an architect who detects the crack hidden beneath a freshly painted wall. One night, for no specific reason, something changed. Laura left the house dressed more provocatively than usual, with an enthusiasm in her eyes that she hadn't shown in a long time. He said it was a work dinner and he would be back late. Daniel nodded without asking questions. He smiled, kissed her on the cheek and closed the door with a calmness he didn't feel. He waited 10 minutes. So he left the house, took the car and followed him. It wasn't impulse, it was necessity. I wanted to understand. He wanted to see with his own eyes what his heart was already beginning to suspect. He saw her drive with determination, without hesitation. He did not take the usual route to the center or go to the agency. He wandered down less busy streets, crossing Crubo barrios, where nothing made sense if it were a work dinner. Finally, he stopped in front of a modest house, hidden among trees and shadows. Daniel turned off the engine and remained silent. He watched as she got out of the car, glanced sideways, and walked to the door. He rang once. Not half a minute passed before it opened. The figure of a man appeared. Tall and firm build, with a shirt open to the chest. She smiled, He took her by the waist and walked in together without looking back. The door closed. Daniel didn't know how long he stayed there. His heart was beating with a violence he never remembered feeling. He took out his cell phone, took a photo. Not for revenge. Out of necessity. Like someone who keeps evidence of something I would never have known. He drove home in silence, as if he was dragging the remains of a version of himself that had just died in that car. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He poured a glass of wine, turned on the lamp in the living room and waited. When she walked in hours later, eyes bright and perfume stirred, she found her sitting in the armchair, with her cell phone screen illuminating her face. There was no scene. There were no insults. Just one question: where were you? Laura stuttered. He invented something that no longer mattered. He showed him the photo. The silence that followed was more devastating than any words. Laura collapsed. He tried to explain. He said incoherent things, he blushed because he felt alone, that it had been a mistake, that he didn't know at what time everything collapsed. Daniel didn't respond. He walked into the living room, closed the door, and didn't speak that night again. The next morning, the house was the same, but nothing was the same. Laura avoided Daniel. He watched her with that look that dissects every detail, every movement, every shadow of the voice. Breakfast was mute. Luca spoke, asked about the park, for the weekend match, oblivious to the tension that surrounded him. Daniel listened to him tenderly, as if he were the only pure piece left from his previous life. During the following days, Laura tried to repair the irreparable. He wanted to explain what had no explanation. He said it meant nothing, that it had been a mess, that it was still his home. Daniel didn't scream, he didn't leave, but he didn't give in either. There was something in his silence that hurt more than any reproach. She started to break down. To cry in the shower. Spending hours staring into space. To look for Clara more often, as if he needed an anchor. Daniel noticed this. And he was silent. Then something unexpected happened. One night, while Daniel was eating dinner alone, his cell phone vibrated. It was an anonymous message. A single image. A photo of Laura and the same man, this time in another place. Another date. Another angle. It wasn't just one night. It hadn't been an accident. Daniel felt the world opening up beneath his feet. I didn't know who had sent the image, but one thing was clear, there was more. Much more. That night he didn't sleep. He began to join stitches. To review old messages, dates, absences. Looking back with the new eyes of someone who woke up from a lie. He realized that he had lived in a drill. That the signs were always there. This love is sometimes not enough to sustain the truth. He decided to act. Not for revenge, but for dignity. He prepared everything. The documents. The accounts. Backup copies. And most importantly, the moment. He planned a confrontation that Laura would never forget. It wouldn't be impulsive. It would be meticulous. Relentless cold. Like the planes he traced with millimeter precision. I knew she didn't expect it. He still believed that he loved her just as much as forgiving everything. And in part, he was right. I still loved her. But love also has limits. When the day came, he waited for Laura to return. She walked in like nothing, with that rehearsed smile, she didn't cheat anymore. Daniel called her into the living room. He asked him to sit down. She, surprised, obeyed. Then, without raising his voice, he told him that he knew everything. I had seen everything. That there was evidence. That your relationship, your marriage, your story, is over. She begged. To cry. He said he could change. That he regretted. That was crazy. That he was your life. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He showed him the divorce papers. He told him he would leave the house. I didn't want explanations. That she could have it all. That he just wanted to regain his peace. Laura was shocked. I didn't understand how he could be so firm. So definitive. But I didn't know that Daniel had already started to heal. That in the midst of darkness, a new truth made its way. And that the person who would change the course of this story, was much closer than she imagined. The house was silent for days. Daniel was left with no scandals, no public ultimatums, no theatrical arguments. Laura was still there, surrounded by the same furniture, the same paintings, the same walls that now seemed to confine themselves like a prison. I didn't know how the world worked without him. He slept poorly, ate little, cried in the bathroom, checked old photos like the one that seemed like evidence that everything was real. Luca stayed with Daniel that week. It was part of the temporary arrangement until things were accommodated. Although nothing seems to happen yet. Clara passed by the house from time to time, she tried to distract her, to comfort her, but her words seemed empty, mechanical, as if she too was exhausted. Laura, however, did not leave aside the only salvation that was her friend. He was the only one who didn't judge her openly, the only one who knew every detail of what had happened, and yet he hadn't moved on. Or so I thought. One afternoon, without warning, Daniel returned. He touched the door firmly. Laura opened up as if her heart had recognized the sound before her feet reached the hall. There were no tears. Don't even smile. Just a dense tension that floated between the two like a truth about to explode. He didn't bring any bags or papers. I brought something worse. A certainty in the eyes that Laura didn't know how to decipher. He asked him to speak. It wasn't a plea. It was a calm order. She invited him in. They sat at the front, like two strangers about to negotiate the remains of a shipwreck. Daniel soon got straight to the point. He said he had not sought reconciliations, forgiveness or close wounds. He came because there was something Laura deserved to know. Something that would completely change her perception of the last few months. She frowned, confused. I didn't know what else could hurt. What else was left to destroy? Daniel began to talk with a calm that chilled the blood. He said that after leaving, he received a message. An address. A strange and anonymous invitation, signed only with a letter. He thought about it for days. Finally, out of curiosity or something deeper, it was. And there, sitting on a wooden bench, I clearly waited. Laura laughed nervously, absurdly and almost mockingly, as if the scene made no sense. But Daniel didn't flinch. Fixed appearance. Clara was the one who contacted him. Not to confess, but to explain what Laura would never have said. At that moment, Laura knew something terrible was about to come to light. He got up. He muttered that he didn't understand, what he had to do clearly in all this. Daniel also stood up, looked at her with a sadness he hadn't shown the day he left. It wasn't the lover. There was already evidence of this, there was already certainty. What Daniel didn't know, what he never suspected, was that while he was suffering, while he was broken inside, there was someone else grieving for him. And not just suffering. Observing. Waiting. Clara fell in love with him. It wasn't a recent drop. He was not born from Laura's betrayal. He was old. Silent. Almost pure. I kept it a secret for years. Out of respect. Out of fear. Because I didn't want to damage what existed between the three of them. But when Laura started cheating on Daniel, when Clara witnessed the deterioration, of the lies, of the fake nights, something inside her broke. He was Laura's confidant, yes. He had heard their confessions. He comforted their failures. But with every word, in every detail, a part of Clara was pulling away. Until he couldn't anymore. Laura tried to laugh again, this time bitterly. He asked if Daniel was with her now, if that was all. That she failed, yes, but he wasted no time. Daniel shook his head. They weren't together. Not yet. Because before starting anything, I needed to close this chapter. I didn't want lies. I didn't want half the truth. He wanted to look at the woman he'd shared more than a decade with and tell her what she never expected to hear, that she didn't just lose her through betrayal, but because another woman, much closer than she suspected, had done what she didn't know how to do. Appreciate. Laura screamed. The voice broke into 1,000 fragments. He asked when, how, why. He said Clara was his friend, his soul sister, the only one who was always there. And Daniel just replied that that was the problem. That Clara was always there. Seeing this. Understand this. Holding. In silence. No cheating. Without destroying. Tears ran down Laura's face without permission. He fell to the floor. I couldn't process it. I couldn't understand. She didn't just lose her husband. He had lost his only ally. For your accomplice. Who he knew each of his darkest secrets. And that woman, loved the same man. And he now knew. Daniel bent down and helped her to get up nicely, but without tenderness. There was no hatred in the hands. Just mercy. He said he didn't know what would happen to Clara. He wasn't interested in thinking about that right now. But he deserved to know. He deserved to clearly see the consequences of everything. Not just what he had done to another man, but what he had ignored all this time. The love he thought he was holding was not invincible. It broke. And when it broke, someone could pick it up. He left without looking back. Laura stood up, motionless. The whole world turned around. I couldn't even hate Clara. Because deep down, I knew there were signs. There were moments. Small details that they ignored. I laughed between the two. Long looks. Shared silences. But he never thought it could mean anything. And now I understand. Clara betrayed her without touching her. And yet, I had done it with more impact than any physical infidelity. That night, Laura called Clara. Don't scream. Do not claim. But to ask why. Clara took the time to respond. When he did, his voice shook. He said that was never his intention. That he hated for feeling what he felt. But Laura went too far. At some point, he stopped deserving Daniel. And that, if one day he decided to look at her, it wouldn't be for revenge. It would be for love. For a love that was too silent. Laura didn't say more. He turned off the lights. And for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. Not for peace. But because the chaos had reached its climax. There was nothing left to lose. All that was left was to watch how the pieces fell. And who was among the rubble? 3 weeks have passed since that devastating conversation in the living room. Laura did not contact Daniel again. Not of course. The house, previously warm, became a mausoleum. The lights remained off most of the time, the dishes were piled up uninformed, the plants in the garden began to dry out. Laura lived in a state of absence, not exactly out of sadness, but out of internal collapse. He stopped understanding how he should continue, how an identity is rebuilt when all certainties are freed from a single day. She had lost her son's trust, her husband's honest look and her best friend's unconditional affection. In the nights, she woke up with a start, with a dry throat and a sharp feeling in her chest that didn't go away until the sunrise began to light the roof with a Maine gray. Meanwhile, Daniel found refuge in a small country house on the outskirts. The property belonged to an old friend who lent it to me, no questions asked. Luca accompanied him during the weekends. During the day they played, cooked together, walked through the forest. At night, Daniel watched him sleep and wondered if one day he would explain what had happened between him and his mother. For now, the boy just asked why they didn't live together anymore. And Daniel responded tenderly, without details, promising that nothing would change in his love for him. Clara didn't look for Daniel. After her conversation with Laura, something inside her closed. Not because of failure. It's not shame. But for a deep need for silence. I didn't want to be the cause of new chaos. He didn't want to present himself as a solution to what was born of pain. And yet, every day I thought about him. In your eyes. In your voice. How he held back even in the midst of collapse, demonstrating a nobility that few men maintain when they are wounded to the core. The inevitable meeting took place on Friday at dusk. Clara passed by a small bookstore when she saw him come out with a paper bag in his hands. He was alone, with a messy scarf and a stubble that made him look like someone different. He also saw her. There were no broad smiles or hasty gestures. Just a break. A long look. And a silence filled with unspoken words. He was the one who spoke first, in a soft voice, asking if he wanted coffee. She doubted it, but nodded. They walked leisurely to an inconspicuous place. They ordered 2 hot drinks and stood near a window. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and alien conversations. For a while they didn't speak. Then, Daniel broke the silence, saying that he had thought about it. I wanted to call her, but I didn't know if it was right. Clara looked down and said she had thought the same thing. That he hated what he felt, but that he couldn't pretend he felt it anymore. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He played with the spoon in his cup as if the words were in the background. Finally, he looked up and told him that he couldn't fake it either. That long ago began to see her differently. That what stopped him wasn't fear, but the story they shared with Laura. Clara took a deep breath. He said he wasn't prepared to be the woman who replaces another. That the possibility of being with him had to come from somewhere else. Not from a vacuum. Not because of pain. Daniel nodded. I understood. But he also said that sometimes love comes in imperfect ways. This is not always born when the world is in order. Sometimes it appears when everything falls apart. And perhaps for that reason, it is stronger. Laura, meanwhile, continued to fall. He returned to work, but without a soul. He made mistakes he never made. His teammates began to notice. Some asked, others walked away. Clara was no longer there to cover her. He also did not respond to her messages. Her friend's betrayal was occurring in ways she could not yet name. Daniel's, on the other hand, became an absence that was increasingly difficult to ignore. I didn't blame it. On the contrary. Sometimes I even admired him. For having had the strength to leave. For not insulting. For leaving her with all the dignity that she herself didn't know how to sustain. One morning, while going through old files on his computer, he found a folder with photos from a trip the 3 of them had taken years ago. In one of them, Clara looked at Daniel with a smile that at the time seemed innocent, but now revealed a truth she never wanted to see. He began to cry uncomfortably. Not out of jealousy. Not for loss. But for the certainty that his blindness had been chosen. That in some corner of his mind, he already knew. But he preferred to ignore it. As the symptoms of a disease are ignored until it becomes irreversible. That same day, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was from school. Luca had a problem. Nothing serious, but they needed an adult. Laura was already there. When Daniel arrived, he saw her waiting for him sitting on a bench. He stood up as soon as he saw him, but didn't come any closer. He walked towards her. They greeted each other with a gesture. They spoke with the director, resolved what was necessary. Then, they went out to park together. Laura asked for a few minutes. He accepted. They walked silently to a nearby park. They sat under a tree. Laura started talking in a voice that sounded like someone else's. He said he wouldn't ask him to come back. That he did not seek further explanations. I just wanted him to know that he understood everything. That the love he deserved was not the one she was capable of giving him. I wish I had found peace, because he was always light. And she, on the other hand, turned off the light out of fear, out of selfishness, out of not knowing how to take care of what she had. Daniel listened to her without interrupting. He didn't comfort her. He wasn't right. He just said thank you. He said he needed to hear this. It wasn't easy to move forward with so much silence between the two. Laura asked if he was clear. He didn't respond immediately. Then, calmly, he said no. Yes, they had spoken. That there were feelings. But not yet. Because love is not built on ruins. It is built on the mainland. And he was still cleaning up the rubble. Laura nodded. I understood. I respected him. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled sincerely. Not out of joy. Of surrender. I knew I had lost. And that was fair. But he also knew, deeply, that Daniel was in good hands. How Clara would take care of him like she didn't know. And that even though it hurt, there was something poetically right about it. When they said goodbye, they hugged each other. It was a long hug, without promises, without a future. Just a closure. A worthy ending to a story that could no longer continue. Days later, Daniel saw Clara again. This time, not in a bookstore, or by chance. He called her. He told him he needed to talk. They met at a shiny new coffee shop. They talked for hours. Not from the past. From the present. What they wanted. What they feared. And then, without warning, Daniel reached for the table. Clara didn't take it away. And so, in the most unexpected place, without fireworks or dramatic statements, something new began. Something real. Something that was not born of pain, but of deep recognition between two souls who finally looked at each other without shadows between them. The transition that came later was quieter than anyone could have predicted. There were no new outbreaks, dramatic letters, or improvised rescue scenes. The chaos that had shaken every foundation had dissipated, but instead there was a constant echo, a kind of melancholic calm that seemed to invade every space that was once full of shared voices, promises, and routines. Daniel didn't speak to Laura after that final hug. Not because I hate her or because there won't be any outstanding problems, but because she understood, with that clarity that only comes after a breakdown, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is get out of someone else's way. There was no farewell, only the inevitable weight of a story that had reached its limit. Clara, on the other hand, began to reconfigure her life from another place. I was no longer in anyone's shadow, neither as a friend nor as a confidant. For the first time in years, he was allowed to feel fearless, without hiding behind misunderstood loyalty. Even so, he didn't run towards Daniel. He didn't want to fill empty spaces. I wanted to know if what existed between them was genuine or just elegant comfort with so much damage. So he took time between them, not out of emotional distance, but out of respect for the process. Daniel understood. And he waited. Luca, in the midst of everything, began to accept that his parents' world was no longer a single home. Daniel ensured that the weekends were memorable, not with expensive activities or spectacular promises, but with total presence. He prepared breakfast as before, he took him to the park, he answered his questions with honesty adapted to his age, without disguising the essentials. The perceptive child no longer asked why mommy cried or why dad slept in another house. It felt like just observing everything from the raw wisdom that children have when facing loss. Daniel felt that even though Luca didn't have the words, he knew. I knew things had changed forever. Laura returned to her parents for a while. He did not support the loneliness of the place that had previously been his refuge. Every corner attacked him with memories, with ghosts of conversations, with now empty laughter. He did not seek anyone's forgiveness, did not intend to atone for failures with forced actions. But there was something about her that needed rebuilding. He enrolled in therapy. He started writing. He filled notebooks with reflections, with truths that, for years, he refused to see. He looked more rudely than ever. And he understood that, in addition to the harm he had done to others, he had betrayed himself. He had been allowed to live a life where silence was more comfortable than honesty, where custom was more tolerable than desire. It was not justified, but for the first time he tried to understand himself. Meanwhile, Clara decided to give up her work at the agency. I couldn't bear the weight of the corridors, the appearance, the whispers. He started collaborating on an independent project, away from the usual focus, away from the noise. He discovered in that pause a way to return to his axis. And only then, when he felt that he was no longer walking from guilt or extreme prudence, he called Daniel. It wasn't a commitment. It wasn't a meeting to define anything. It was a long walk along a park path at sunset, no agenda, no plans. They just walked, talked about little things, laughed shyly, and in the end, on any bench, they took hands. They didn't kiss. Nothing was promised. They just let this new way of being together breathe. But life, with its unstable nature, does not allow stories to settle down without testing their edges. One day, Laura received a job offer in another city. It was an important and challenging position, with a good salary. He didn't think much about it. He saw it as a way out, as an opportunity to start somewhere else where he didn't carry his past. But that meant Luca would have to spend more time with Daniel. And it also involved facing the dilemma of physical distance with a child who had already experienced enough emotional fractures. Laura doubted it. He debated between her legitimate desire to rebuild herself and her inalienable role as a mother. He argued with Daniel. It was a long conversation, full of pauses and difficult questions. He didn't object, but it was clear. He told him that for the first time he was at peace, that he had learned to dwell in his pain without letting it consume him. And that, if she felt she had to leave, she would do so knowing that Luca would be well looked after, but also that this decision came with an emotional cost that she had to accept with courage. Laura appreciated his honesty. He knew he was right. I couldn't keep escaping. I couldn't put distance as a solution again. So he proposed an alternative: stay longer, but move to another place within the same city. A new space, without previous history, without shared shadows. A home where she could start another version of herself, without cutting ties with her son. Daniel accepted. I appreciated that gesture. It was a sign of maturity, a real attempt to build something out of responsibility. And in the midst of this new order, something unexpected emerged. An invitation. A wedding. Not from Daniel or Clara. But from an old mutual friend. Laura didn't know if she should attend. I knew Daniel would be there. Probably also Clear. But he decided to go. For dignity. For showing that she could look at him. It was prepared carefully. Not to impress, but to feel good. When he arrived, he saw them. First for him. So for her. They were together, but not as a show-off couple. They laughed among other friends. They noted comfortable. There was a different complicity between them. It is not the intensity of a newborn love, but the firmness of two people who have learned to take care of the roots. Daniel saw her. He approached with respect. He greeted her with a sincere, unburdened smile. Clara also greeted her. There were no uncomfortable gestures or air tension. Just the tacit evidence that the three of them had changed. At some point during the night, Laura approached Clara. He asked for a minute alone. They set off under a pergola adorned with soft lights. Laura took a deep breath. He told her that for a long time she hated her, she felt that something vital had been taken away, but now she understood that no one steals what another neglects. How Clara was not his enemy. That, in essence, was her being the one who left the space that someone else occupied without violence. Clara didn't know what to answer. He just looked at her with moistened eyes. They hugged. It was a tense hug, brief, but enough. After this encounter, there was no need for any more words. Everyone returned to their own space. At your pace. For your own reconstructions. Daniel and Clara began to share more time together, without fear, without the burden of an unresolved past. They didn't live together yet, but they shared weekends, projects, books, little rituals that spoke of a life that was built step by step. Laura, in her new apartment, painted. Something that the university did not do. He filled his walls with abstract, colorful canvases that he had never been allowed to use before. He began teaching art to children. That laughed more. He reconciled little by little with his reflection. But there was still a decision pending. A final closure. Something Daniel had to face. Something that was not resolved with new loves or internal peace. A profound dilemma that would test everything he had learned. Something that, when revealed, would force him to choose between emotional justice and absolute compassion. And there would be no rear. It had appeared with dense clarity, as if heaven had predicted that something was about to conclude. Daniel looked out the window of his studio while Luca slept in the next room, surrounded by books, toys and drawings hung with tape on the wall. The child had adapted to the new scheme without drama. He had the maturity of someone who had seen the world fall apart and, even so, decided to continue loving those who were standing. Daniel watched him with a mixture of fierce admiration and responsibility. He couldn't afford to fail. Everything he had made of the breakup, from the silence to the new decisions, revolved around this unwritten commitment to keep his emotional world intact. However, that day brought a different burden. Because after so many months of distance, pauses and prudent silences, Clara had said yes. Yes to a life together. Yes to stop treading carefully. Yes to taking the step that both of you have postponed for so long. They decided to look for a house, not hers, but a new one, where every corner was born from scratch, without the echoes of other stories. Clara proposed a quiet neighborhood, with trees and old streets where silence sounded promised. Daniel accepted without arguing. Finally, we were allowed to stop thinking of the past as a permanent ghost. Everything seemed lined up, until the call came. It was a Saturday afternoon. Laura. They hadn't been in contact for weeks. He hesitated to answer, but he did. His voice on the other end sounded restrained, different. He said he needed to talk, but not to her. It was for Luca. Something I discovered, something I couldn't shut up about. They saw each other the next day in a discreet coffee shop. Laura arrived with a folder in her hands, dark eyes, pale face. There were no preambles. He told him that when he reviewed old documents, he found inconsistencies in the records at the hospital where Luca was born. I never suspected. But an absurd curiosity led her to ask for a copy of the original papers and contrast them with her own clinical history. So he did a genetic test on his own, first out of concern, then out of fear. The result was in the folder. Daniel looked at her silently, without touching the envelope. She looked down. He said he didn't understand how it happened. I had never intended to lie to him. That when she found out she was pregnant, she believed, and swore convinced, that it was his. But now I knew no. That Luca's biological father was someone else. Not a stranger. The man he cheated on him with. Daniel didn't react immediately. He took the envelope. He opened it. He read the words as if they were part of a foreign language. He understood everything, but a part of his mind refused to accept the magnitude of what he had just heard. It wasn't just another betrayal. It was the root of everything. The center of his life, his engine, his son, was not born from him. But then, something unusual happened. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. I didn't curse her. He just took a deep breath. He said he needed time to process it. And he left. Clara found her that night sitting on the porch, with her eyes fixed on the ground. He told him everything. No ornaments. Without omitting the slightest detail. She listened without interrupting. He took the hand. He told him not to release him. I didn't have to decide anything right away. That he shouldn't feel pressured to love someone who wasn't his son. But he interrupted her. He said Luca was his. That he raised him, careful, hugged him on his feverish nights, laughed with his stories. That he loved him even before he knew what his face looked like. That blood wasn't the only bond a father formed. And that this child, this boy who called him father, with unwavering certainty, was still his, more than ever. Clara cried. Not for the revelation. But for the kind of man in front of her. One capable of absorbing pain without turning it into poison. One who decided from love and not from ego. In the same week, Daniel asked to speak to Laura again. He thanked her for her honesty. He told him that although what he did hurt, he valued that this secret would not be taken to the grave. That forgave him. Not because she deserved it, but because he needed to live without resentment. He also asked that he mentioned any of this to Luca. At least not yet. When the time came, he would be the one to sit down with the child to explain the truth, if that truth was necessary. Over time, life reacted again. Daniel and Clara moved. The house was warm, with high roofs and a small garden. Clara hung plants in the windows. Daniel built a wooden library where he kept the books he had read with his son. Luca adapted quickly. Clara did not try to occupy her mother's house. It was just presence, comfort, discreet tenderness. Laura, on the other hand, dedicated herself to painting more intensely. He first presented at a local gallery. He sold some work. He donated others to children's centers. He started talking about emotional reconstruction. I was not proclaimed an example of anything. I only shared what I learned through pain. A year later, Daniel organized a small gathering at home. Nothing formal. Just close friends, people who were present in the process. In the middle of the celebration, Luca approached him. He told him he wanted to ask him a question. Daniel nodded. The boy, with that heartbreaking frankness that has always characterized him, asked if he ever thought about leaving him when everything changed. Daniel crouched down, looked him in the eyes and told him no. That he wasn't his son for an article or result. That he was his son because he chose him every day, even when it hurt to breathe. Luca hugged him without saying more. And at that moment, Daniel knew that everything he lived was worth it. The story did not end with fireworks. There was no perfect ending. Only the people who fell, broke and decided to get back up with more truth. Laura, alone, but at peace. Clara, loving without asking permission. Daniel, scarred, but free. Luca, with a childhood marked by complexity, but surrounded by real love. And in the midst of it all, a powerful lesson: this betrayal not only destroys, it also reveals. That there is no reconstruction without truth. And sometimes, when it feels like we've lost everything, that's where life really begins. Now it's up to you. Comment below, or did you think of this story? Your opinion and very important people to continue creating narratives that touch and cause reflection. I wasn't subscribed to the channel to follow the story. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. Hi here, we show how IT can ruin lives and leave deep marks. I played it from close range.